Hi guys, it's Economics here, and today I want to bring you the next in the series with regard to literacy and reading around the subject. So you'll know that we are currently reading this book by Mr. Joseph Stiglitz, and so I want to now just carry on with my summary with regard to chapter 1. So this is the second installment with regard to chapter 1. So where are we? We just finished off by considering the whole notion of this one-size-fits-all interest rate policy set by the European Central Bank, and we had also considered the flaws involved with this thing called the Stability and Growth Pact, which is primarily with regard to fiscal policy. So Stiglitz goes on in this chapter to consider a theory that we're currently looking at in year 12, where we have been considering Mr. Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, responsible for the theory of the invisible hand, talking about the fact that markets are supposed to be extremely flexible and able to adjust instantaneously to economic shocks because the markets are so flexible, and as a consequence any shocks will not persist, and the economy will be guided by this thing called the invisible hand. It will be guided back to the socially optimum equilibrium position once again. Now, architects of the euro back in the day, Stiglitz would argue that the architects of the euro, they had great faith in the markets. So this type of, it's called nowadays market fundamentalism or neoliberalism, this whole notion that these markets will adjust instantaneously. And so the architects of the euro thought that if the government of the time ensured that inflation was low, then markets would adjust and ensure that there was growth and prosperity for all. And this was certainly a very, very strong belief in the flexibility of markets. There was a very strong belief in the flexibility in the German economy in particular. However, Stiglitz cites a couple of examples where this has gone a little wrong. So he talks about in Africa, this whole notion of market flexibility really led to 25 years of little or no growth in Africa. In Latin America, 10 years similarly. And he also cites the quite disappointing growth numbers in the former communist states, the former USSR, back in the USSR, tremendous Beatles tune, where there was a move away from communism and the state planning economy system more towards opening up to markets. And obviously all the former Eastern Bloc countries, which have experienced relatively disappointing growth as they have tried to rely upon the markets to be flexible and ensure that that growth comes. So our advocates of the euro, however, would say there's an acronym that Stiglitz refers to in his book, TINA, T-I-N-A. And these people who are advocates of TINA, they would say that there is no alternatives to the euro. Stiglitz, on the other hand, argues quite the opposite. Stiglitz would say the status quo will not work. And Stiglitz argues that there either has to be more Europe or less Europe, but things cannot go on as they are. Now, advocates of the euro would say that it was the euro was intended to do the following things, and Stiglitz makes a note of these in his book, and they're worth considering in turn. So number one, the euro would increase the efficiency of resource allocation. Obviously, when resources are scarce, we're talking about this in year 12 at the moment, you know, the basic fundamental economic problem. So increase efficiency of resources, pursue the principles of comparative advantage. Again, year 12, we've just been considering this, that countries, when they specialise according to the law of comparative advantage, they gain, but because that then enables them to trade, if there is a free trade area, which of course there is within the Eurozone and the European Union, then that should, in theory at least, raise the living standards in all countries concerned. It should enhance competition. This whole notion of something called price transparency should increase competition. So what is this thing called price transparency? Well, whenever you have to convert one currency to another in order to compare prices, so if you want to compare, for example, the cost of a Volkswagen Golf purchased in the UK to the cost of or the price of a Volkswagen Golf purchased in Germany, obviously you have to do work out in a common currency what the actual price will be. Well, when everything is priced in the one currency, so the euro, so the Italians don't have the lira anymore, the Spanish don't have the peseta, the Germans don't have the Deutschmark, it's all in euro. And so therefore you don't have this, sometimes what can be rather confusing exchange rate calculation to do. You can just look across all the countries, you can see where your Volkswagen Golf is the cheapest, and potentially you can just go and order it and purchase it from there. So that should enhance competition. Fourthly, it should enable economies and firms within those economies to take advantage of economies of scale. What are economies of scale? Textbook definition: those aspects of increasing size which lead to falling average costs. So the basic premise is that as firms, if they are specialising according to their comparative advantage, so the inefficient firms will close, the big firms will grow, they in turn will be able to benefit from, for example, buying in bulk, getting great finance deals on their borrowings and so on, and as a consequence of that their costs fall, and in theory they ought to be able to pass those costs on to us, the consumer. It should strengthen economic stability. Remember, one of the key foundations and the rationale behind the euro is, yes, increased prosperity, but let's not engage in war any longer. And obviously after the Treaty of Rome in 1957, that was very prominent at the time and still is today. And finally, to enhance political integration and help to solidify the one which we've mentioned previously, that whole sort of notion of peace. But Stiglitz would argue that all of these things, as a consequence of introducing the euro, these are all now further away than they ever were previously. Now, Stiglitz would argue that the real test of the euro and how successful it was going to be would come when there was an asymmetric shock to the economy. So an asymmetric shock is a shock which affects one part of the economy, or one country in the Eurozone for example, but not others. And that would really test how flexible the markets were. And he goes on to explain how this notion of an asymmetric shock, and we'll come back to this later, this has been one of the great downfalls of the euro and the Eurozone project. Stiglitz cites, for example, the fact that the USA's economy, although it did suffer from the financial crash, it's now 10% bigger, or it was 10% bigger in 2015 than it was in 2007. If you look at Europe's, it has hardly changed, and indeed, let's not forget that Europe saw a double dip recession, ladies and gentlemen, rather than just one little recession. Whereas he cites the fact that Sweden and Norway, which lie outside of the Eurozone, they have done relatively well. And so Stiglitz would argue that the whole reason that the Eurozone's performance has been poor is simply because of the single currency, the fixed exchange rate system, the euro. So I'm going to leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm still not finished there actually on chapter 1. There's so much theory and great stuff in this book. You can only, I think if you're reading this, just read a couple of pages, digest it, and sort of draw all your knowledge of economics together. It's a great sort of synoptic read, this, because you do need to understand all of your economics to understand the book. So see you again next time.